Hi everyone, this is Vera Nazarian. How are you? I'm coming to you live or actually pre-recorded, and this is an event that is a part of the convention, TAGCon 2023 Golden Disc of Ra. And it's one of the panels that's happening as part of the convention, and this is a reading. So what I'm going to do today is read to you from one of my books. This book, COBWEB BRIDE. Let's see if I can open it better. There we go. This is the hardcover edition, one of the original cover edition. And what this book is quite unlike the Atlantis Grail. Now, all of you have read my Atlantis Grail series. You know what that is. It's a science fiction, near future, and also ancient past. So it jumps to the past and then goes in the near future in the year 2047, 48, and so on. Well, what this is a high fantasy. It's an epic high fantasy that takes place in the Renaissance. So it's completely different. And it has the flavor of a fairy tale, and it also has a flavor of the Game of Thrones, because this is about death. It's actually a story of Persephone and Hades, but retold with a really crazy twist. Because what happens is, it's a story of death stopping all across the board. Nobody can die, and it's the Renaissance. And it's a small, magical or fabulous kingdom somewhere in Europe, and death comes and announces that he will no longer take anyone's soul until he can get back his cobweb bride. Nobody knows who she is. Nobody has heard of her. People are scared, confused, because nobody can die. And it sounds great, right? Well, maybe not so much. So what I'm going to do is I will read to you the first chapter of this book, and then you can judge for yourself how good or bad it is. what happens when you have no dying. All right, so here we go. This is COBWEB BRIDE, and it's chapter 1. He came to them in the heart of winter, asking for his cobweb bride. He arrived everywhere, all at once. In one singular moment, he was seen, heard, felt, remembered. Some inhaled his decaying scent. Others bitterly tasted him. And everyone recognized death in one way or another just before the world was suspended. But death's human story began in Lethe, one of the 3 kingdoms of the imperial realm. It was evening, and the city of Letheburg reposed in amber lantern lights and thickening blue shadows. At some point, there had been a silence, a break in the howling of the wind as the snow started to fall. The silence preceded him. Flakes of white glimmered through the frost-blurred glass of the myriad windows of the winter palace of Lethe. In moments, the snowflakes turned into armies. They piled and compounded, stretched and distended into geometric symmetry. Folding into garlands of impossible gauze veils, they appeared at last to be the faint and vaporous spinnings of a sky-sized ice spider casting its web upon the world. While the pallor and the darkness grew outside, death was arriving within, inside a bedchamber permeated with illness, the boudoir of the old queen. In silence he formed, out of the cobwebs of the gilded crown molding near the ceiling, the dust motes of desolation and the fallen shadows in the corner. All these tiny bits and pieces of the mortal world rushed together to shape him. He began as gray smoke, then darkness, deeper than soot. His form solidified into a man, gaunt and tall, clad in black velvet like a grim Spaniard. He wore no cape, but somehow his face was hooded, as though a veil rippled between him and anyone who might look. The first to notice him was the woman sitting in a chair at the foot of the great bed, farthest away from the fireplace, a regal, middle-aged woman in a heavy brocade dress of deep green. She saw him and gasped, forgetting her stoic demeanor. At the woman's reaction, the distinguished man with silver at his temples standing next to her, leaning as he had been for hours it seemed over the bed and its decrepit occupant, turned to look, and he was taken with paralysis, able only to stare. Finally, the fading old creature who lay in the bed, ethereal as a desiccated fairy, sunken in layers of soft winter mahogany fleece and cream silk, turned her clouded gaze in the direction of the presence. "Who are you?" the seated woman in the green brocade asked, at the same time as the man leaning over the bed exclaimed, "Guards!" But the old woman lying in bed merely rattled the air in her throat and lifted a gnarled, trembling finger, pointing. There was profound relief in that gesture, a final offering of the self. But the one who stood before her, before them all, did not respond. Moments gathered around him like the fluttering yet unfailing pulse beat in the old woman's throat. And then, at long last, he spoke. "No!" With a clanging of metal, guards came running into the chamber, but they too seemed to lose urgency and lined up at the doors watching with transfixed faces. "No!" he repeated, in a voice as distant as the falling snow outside the window. "I may not have you. Instead, I must have my cobweb bride." "Who are you?" the woman in green tried again. Underneath her formally coiffed hair, the color of dark tea, bright drops of faceted yellow topaz sparkled in her earlobes, reflecting the flames. Tiny pearls sat in the intricacy of her collar lace, but her voice was dull, without inflection, for she knew very well who it was. "Death stands before you," he replied with the softness of the final breath. "Have you come to take from us Her Majesty, my mother and our queen?" whispered the man who had summoned the guards. He wore expensive velvet garments of deep mourning and had a stern face framed by dark hair with its beginnings of grizzle, undisguised by a powdered wig. There was no need for ceremonial formalities in this bedchamber, at least not today. "No, Prince," Death replied. "I have come for my cobweb bride and none other. No one else will I take unto me until I have her at my side." "What does that mean?" said Roland Oseni. He who was indeed a prince of Lethe, and who would have been king in the next 3 breaths had they been the old queen's last. "A cobweb bride?" echoed Lucia Oseni, the woman in the chair, who was the prince's wife and consort, and would have been the new queen. "Who is this cobweb bride, and where might she be found, to be delivered unto you?" Meanwhile, the old queen, Andrelise Oseni of Lethe, let her hand drop on the coverlet. Skeletal fingers twitching, she lay gurgling, drowning in her own spittle, the death rattle in her throat an unending rhythmic sound. "Oh God, have mercy!" Princess Lucia stood up in reflex at the awful new sound and came forward to stare at the dying queen, wringing her own hands clad with heavy gold rings. She clenched her fingers so hard that the metal and jewels cut into her flesh. Pain shot through her, clean and sharp. Pain, cleansing the mind. But there was to be no clarity and no death that night. Bring to me my cobweb bride. Bring her to the gates of death's keep that stands in the northern forest. Only then will I grant relief and resume taking your kind unto me. Until then, none shall die. And as the voice faded into echoes of cold stone, so did the form of shadows and black soot, until only mortals were left in the room. Did they imagine it? Had it been a flicker of the mind, a waking dream? The crackling flame in the fireplace cast a golden red glow upon them all, and the old queen's death rattle continued. Death's second stop was simultaneous, yet many leagues away to the north. Evening twilight encroached with blue and indigo upon the whiteness of the frozen Lake Merlate. It was a scene of slowing battle between the forces of Duke Ian Chidair, known as Hoarfrost, and the armies of his neighbor, the Duke Vitalio Gorak. Neither side as yet had the upper hand. Winter wind howled in fury while heavy cavalrymen and horses struggled in a slow melee, immense metal-clad knights bringing broadswords and maces down upon each other to cleave and bludgeon. Joined with the screaming wind in a discord were the clangor of iron and shouts and groans of agony as the wounded and the slain soldiers piled upon the whiteness. Footmen slipped and moved up between the feet of the great war horses, and long pikes pierced chainmail and mail plate butting up against the ice. There were places where the ice had cracked. Here men and beasts had fallen through into the gaping blackness, the sludge water thick and slow underneath the ice. The dead and the living had intermingled, and common blood stained the top layer of the ice with dark red. Pale rose in places, deep as burgundy in others. Then, all of a sudden, the wind died. Except for the ringing metal and human cries, there had come silence. With it came horror. One beheaded soldier continued to move. His severed head, together with its helmet, eyes still blinking, mouth distended into a cry, rolled into the gaping hole in the ice, sinking into the breach. But the headless torso, now blind and staggering, continued to wield the sword and to swing it wildly. Behind him, another soldier, wearing red and gold, Duke Vitalio Gorak's colors, was pierced through the heart with a long pike. Instead of collapsing, he froze in place for several long, shuddering moments. Then, as the one who struck him down stared in disbelief, the soldier took hold of the shaft and pulled it out of his own chest, shouting in agony. And he continued to fight, while blood darker than his tunic poured out of his wound in a spurting fountain. A few feet away, a knight in an overturned tunic surcoat of palest frost blue, its color blurring into the surrounding ice in the intensifying twilight, decorated with the ornate crest of Duke Hoarfrost, fell from his war horse from the impact of a great broadsword blow. He fell upon the ice and threw it, for the burden of his plate armor weighed him down as though he was an anvil. The knight sank, screaming, while the sludge black water closed over his head, seeping into his undertunic, and all the crevices with a shock of excruciating cold. And he continued screaming silently with all the force of his lungs that collapsed and then filled with the ice water while he was being consumed by universal agony of cold fire and impossible stifling pressure. All his muscles spasmed, and yet his heart did not shut down instantly from the shock. His heart went on beating, slow and stately, like a nice drum, then slowing down gradually, as though unwinding mechanical gears, while his blood, now as cold as the water in the lake, crawled through him sluggishly. And still the nights descended, flailing his limbs in the absolute darkness and cold, while his mind chanted a prayer to God for an end that would not come. Eventually he hit the bottom of the lake, thick with mud. He lay there, unable to move from the weight of his armor and from the constricted and frozen muscles of his body, unable to breathe and suffocating without end, yet not losing consciousness. His face, now invisible to any other living being, was clenched in a rictus of horror, and prayers were replaced with madness. Directly above him, no more than 50 feet through the freezing waters, upon the ice crust surrounding the breach through which he had fallen, the battle went on. But it had taken a turn of unreality. Men on both sides continued to strike mortal blows, but their opponents faltered, only briefly. Many of the slain picked themselves back up from the ice and continued fighting, even though they were soon drained of all blood. Others stood or lay, howling in unrelieved pain from deadly wounds and mutilations, neither losing consciousness nor life. Sorcery! By God, this is dark, witching sorcery! Fall back! Fall back! Duke Vitalio Gorak cried, thrown into sudden mindless terror by the realization of what was happening around him. It did not matter that he was surrounded by a solid circle of his best knights and henchmen, while behind him rode the royal pennant bearer, holding aloft the red and gold banner with the Gorak crest. It did not matter that they had advanced such a significant distance across the frozen lake and were more than halfway to the western shore that marked the outer boundary of the lands held by his enemy, Hoarfrost. None of it mattered. The Red Duke attempted to fight his way back from the middle of the frozen lake to the eastern shore, where his reserve detachment waited. On the other end of the lake, a mere 10 or 20 feet from the western shore, flew the pennant of the palest blue, now obscured by the evening murk, with the crest of Chidare. Duke Hoarfrost himself, Ian Chidare, sat on his tall, grey charger like a rock, while continuing to swing his broadsword at the enemy knights. Next to him fought his son, Lord Beltane Chidare, protecting his father's formidable back. He moved deep in a berserker fury, demonic and terrifying. No matter how tired he had to be at this point, few dared to approach the young knight who had never been defeated in combat. The few remaining Chidare knights at their side were dull with exhaustion. None had yet noticed the peculiar consequences of what should have been mortal strikes, attributing it to the enemy's tenacity. After all, Chidare had been pushed back into retreating to their own shores of the lake, and the cessation of the ice wind against their numb faces was merely perceived as a blessed minor relief. But then they saw in the distance near the heart of the lake that Duke Gorak's forces seemed to be regrouping and then retreating east. It made no sense. Why was Gorak retreating? He had the upper hand. Though evenly matched in general, the battle had been hardest upon Duke Hoarfrost's army, especially in these last minutes. The only explanation for the uncalled for retreat of Duke Gorak's men was that they must have been deceived by something in the growing dusk, or maybe they were unwilling to continue the battle of night. "Accursed cowards!" Duke Hoarfrost exclaimed, panting hard. With a great backhanded blow he delivered a killing strike to the neck of the last Gorak knight within sword range before him. A strike that should have severed collarbone and ribs and cleared the immediate area of any remaining opponents. The knight did not fall, but slumped forward in the saddle to lie against the neck of his warhorse from the impact of the received blow. Blood spurted down the front of his already ruddy surcoat, as his heart pumped the life liquid out of the damaged body. Within moments, he will have drawn his last breath. Himself near collapse, breathing in shuddering gasps of exhaustion, Duke Hoarfrost turned his back to the defeated enemy and addressed the pennant bearer of his house. "Lauren," he spoke between breaths, "raise the banner to its fullest. We will now rally to strike them and drive them." He never finished, because in that moment a long dagger was lodged and twisted with surprising force in his lower back near the kidneys, deep to the hilt, in that vulnerable spot right between the mail plates. And a moment later, a broadsword point struck him higher, between the ribs, running in through the heart and out the front of his chest cavity. The point of the sword was stopped only by the hard inner surface of the chest plate. Then the blade was withdrawn. Searing agony, an instant of vertigo that should have been followed by instant oblivion. But Duke Hoarfrost, Ian Chedare, mortally pierced twice, remained alive. And alive, he screamed in impossible pain. He screamed while blood came spurting out of him, from his back and his chest, from the hole near his kidneys, and past the clenched jaws, and into his mouth, so that he tasted his own serum and bile, choked on it, while his lungs were filling rapidly, so that he was now drowning. And yet, slowly, Duke Hoarfrost turned around. Staggering in the saddle, he faced the slain knight, who once again sat upright in his own saddle, and who held a broadsword covered with Hoarfrost's blood. The dagger remained lodged in Chedare's back. "No!" Beltane, his son, cried. "No, father! Oh, in the name of God, no!" Duke Hoarfrost gurgled, unable to breathe, and then with a supreme effort he threw himself at the enemy knight. The two of them went down from the impact. Neither one cared any longer that to be unseated meant they would likely be unable to rise up and mount again, that it meant sure death. What difference would it make when they were dead already, or undead? For neither of them could possibly be alive. The impact of two bodies collapsing against the ice resulted in a slow fissure, then a growing crack. Their war horses stumbled, yet managed to regain footing and scrambled away to a safe distance, while all around the Chedare knights backed away, leaving a perimeter around the collapsing ice. Down the incline and into the churning sludge, the two fallen men slipped, weighed down by the immense poundage of their armor, still grappling with each other as the thick waters closed overhead, bubbling. Within moments, there was only stillness. The ice pieces gently bobbed on top of the sludge. "Holy Mother of God, have mercy upon your loyal servant Ian Chedare, and receive him unto your bosom," Beltane whispered, crossing himself. He removed his helmet in grief and in final honor of his fallen Lord Father. In the dark, his eyes were without an end, places leading only into hell. His hair like filaments of the night. Some distance away, there were various sounds of retreat. Gorak's soldiers returned to their own side of the lake, while straggling figures of Hoarfrost's men started to fall back to the place where the Duke himself had just sunk in the waters so near the shore. In the darkness, it was not clearly visible that some of these men should not have been walking upright. Indeed, many did not realize their own condition, feeling only numbness and winter closing in, and attributing it to the circumstances of battle. From the shores came the reserve troops, soldiers carrying torches to illuminate the scene of battle, for at last it was true night. "Soldiers of Chedare, all of you now my men, good, brave men," Beltane continued, his face illuminated with the angry red flickering of torches. "I promise to you, his death will not go unavenged. I now count on your loyalty to—" But his words tapered off into silence, because in that moment, the ice at the shore of the lake began to shatter, and then was shattered violently from the inside out. It was broken by the blow of a metal-clad fist emerging from the lake itself. The fist was followed by an arm and then another. The two hands tore and pounded at the ice until it cracked and shattered, and the hole widened, became the girth of a man's body, then wider yet. At last a human shape burst forth, sputtering and gasping, then throwing up water mixed with blood upon the shore. He stood up, the waters coming up to his waist. Then, bracing himself with his arms, he crawled out and lay upon the surface at the edge of the hole, clad in mail, and a soaked, darkened surcoat that should have been faint blue, the color of frost. He had lost his crested helmet underneath the ice of the lake, but the hair plastered to the skull with ice water was unmistakably that of the Duke Hoarfrost, Ian Chedare, lord of the westlands of Chedare within the kingdom of Lethe. He lay twitching upon the ice, while lake water and the last vestiges of his own blood came pouring out of the fissures in his body, and then he slowly raised his head. Illuminated by the torches of his own soldiers, a pale, bloodless face of the man they knew and served looked at them impassively. He was like a god of winter, white with a bluish tint. The water was freezing into true ice upon the plains of his face, rimming his brows and hair with dead crystalline whiteness. Duke Hoarfrost stood up, while many, including his own son, reined in their mounts to move away, and foot soldiers took an involuntary step back and onto the shore, away from the ice. "Father?" Beltane Chedare whispered, his voice cracking. "Are you my father? Are you dead?" And the man before him parted his frozen lips and then spewed forth more brackish water and the last taint of living blood. He then moved one awkward hand behind him to pull out the dagger from his back. "My son," he croaked, "I don't know." Death's third stop was intimate, and once again no time had elapsed. In a poor house with a badly thatched roof, no attic, and a drafty ceiling of old wooden rafters, one of the most decrepit dwellings in the village of Orclaven in the dukedom of Gorak, which in turn lay within the kingdom of Lethe, an old peasant woman lay dying. She was Bethesda Iron, possibly older than the elm tree growing in the backyard. She was a widow, the mother of two sons, one of whom owned this house, and the grandmother of one grandson and three granddaughters. It was a rather small family, as peasant families went. Bethesda had been beautiful in her day, with cream skin and bright auburn hair that was long and soft as goose down and shimmered as apricot silk in sunlight. She wore it loose once or twice when a maiden, and it had caught the eye of a passing lordling's handsome son. As a result, Bethesda was made to braid her hair tightly, cover her head with discreet cotton, and was married soon after to Joan Iron, a solid young man of respectable village family. Very quickly after that, she gave birth to a handsome boy. Bethesda's husband was a kind and fair man, and he took the boy and treated him as his own. Eventually, a second son was born, and this one resembled the father in his plainness and kindness. By the time Bethesda and Johan grew old, but not quite decrepit, the older son, handsome Guel, had prospered and married an apple orchard owner's daughter, who bore him a healthy son, and the three of them had gone to live in the large town Fioren, just south of Letheburg. It was the second son, Alan, who had remained with Bethesda and his father to care for his aging parents. Johann died shortly after, and there was no one but Bethesda and Alan to tend to the crumbling house and the small plot of land with the field and the vegetable garden. Alan took a wife then, and she resembled his mother in many ways. Neobea was a beautiful woman from Fioren, who had the mixed fortune to work as a lady's fine seamstress. She married poor Alan Iron, because no one else would have her after she too had caught the roving eye of her lady's son, and could not avoid hers even more roving hands. In the lady's household, Neobea had been taught how to read, in order to entertain the mistress at her sewing, and thus acquired a fine taste. Neobea gave long and elegant names to her peasant daughters, as they were born almost one right after the other, with not a son in sight. The eldest daughter, whose father may or may not have been Alan, was called Parabelle. She was fair like a field of flax, and delicate like imported porcelain in the fancy town shops. Her hair was rich and bountiful, a sea of dawning pallor with a hint of amber and gold, several shades lighter than her grandmother's had been, but of the same glorious texture, falling like a cloak around her when unbound. Her body was slim and well proportioned, and as she approached womanhood, she stood nearly as tall as her father. Even when she worked in the field at Alan's side, the sun was kind to her. It ripened her apple golden, and her skin did not lose its fresh elasticity or its delicate sheen. Belle was beautiful indeed, and they came to call her thus. Additionally, she was obedient, humble, intelligent, and soft-spoken, a perfect daughter and granddaughter, loved dearly by all. The second daughter came 2 springs and a half later, plain and dull, and was given the name Persephone. It was as though all beauty, all the life juices had been wrung out of Neobea in the birthing of Parabelle, so that none of it was left over to imbue Persephone with energy. Percy was a sickly child, somewhat dull-witted and slow, likely to stop her work and stare at shadows, at nothings. She was darker, her hair of an indeterminate color somewhere between brown, black, and ash. Her skin and face were anemic pale, not frail in a lovely way, but unhealthy. She burned readily in the sun, unlike her older sister, and soon enough would be peeling and covered with red welts. Eventually they made her wear an additional cotton scarf in the field to cover most of her face and her neck, not to mention shirts with extra thick long sleeves. Percy was also stocky, with a straight waist that would never be willowy, leaning too fat, and clumsy like a dog let loose in the house. She broke crockery every other day, it seemed, so that her mother, Neobea, sometimes cried just looking at her, for she knew that to get her a husband might be an impossible task. Worst of all, Percy was a willful child and would ignore tasks she had no heart for. Good for nothing, Neobea called her. A clod, a stubborn idiot girl. And Neobea prayed for a more graceful child next time. Indeed, because nature always seeks a balance, beauty returned to the family. The third daughter came 3 summers later during the autumn harvest, and she was an angelic child who promised to be as beautiful as the eldest. Neobea spoke a prayer of thanks and named her Patriciana. Patty was not as exquisitely beautiful as Belle, but she made up for it in vivacity and energy. A child with ruddy cheeks and curly chestnut locks. Before she was old enough to work, she ran around the house singing and wailing and laughing, and she tormented old Bethesda with stories and questions until Belle would gently scold her while her mother would hide a smile and give her an apple and tell her to run and play outside. Often, as little Patty came outside after the mild scolding, Percy would be working in the vegetable patch, and she would wave and beckon. And as soon as Patty settled down next to her ungainly, dirt-covered older sister, Percy would resume pulling the carrots and pruning the spinach leaves, appearing so intent on her task. But eventually, without fail, Percy would launch on a strange tale, usually filled with frightful creatures and mysterious happenings, all of it told in an oddly compelling voice, and using root vegetables like puppets for colorful props. They grew together thus until Belle was 18, Percy 16, and Patty an energetic 13-year-old. It was then that their grandmother's time drew to a close, and Bethesda lay dying. Evenings came early in winter, and ailing Bethesda was laid out in a corner bed as far away from the drafts as possible, and wrapped in several old woolen blankets. The fireplace had been lit early, a mixture of dry and sodden logs and twigs crackling and sputtering angrily with smoke as the wind outside howled and gusts of it came tearing down the filthy chimney. The windows were shuttered tight, but it was not enough to keep out the winter cold. So Belle, now a willowy maiden, beautiful despite the gray homespun dress and work-calloused fingers, went around the house and stuffed additional bunches of folded rags in all the crevices and along the windowsills. "Why is it so dark, child?" suddenly came from the bed in the corner, as Bethesda spoke in a faint, rasping voice. "And why is it so quiet?" Lying against the lumpy pillow, Belle stopped her task and came quickly to her grandmother's side. Lying against the lumpy pillow, covered with faded cotton that was worn thin from endless washings, Bethesda's wrinkled face had turned wide gray. Eyes the color of coals reposed deep in sockets of bone and skin, and her withered hands had been bent into gnarled claws by arthritis. Belle held them now, feeling the cold fingers. They were like branches of the old snow-covered elm outside. "It is dark because a storm is rising," Belle said gently in a melodic voice. "I've lined the shutters tight and lit the fireplace." "Gran, can you not see the fire?" a younger voice sounded, as Patty came forward from her place at the wooden table, where she was mixing buckwheat flour batter and peeling stale turnips for their evening meal. Patty's bright eyes and cheeks were warmed by the light of the flames, and her nose had a smear of dirt from the tubers she's been cleaning. Their mother, Neobea, a gaunt, middle-aged woman, sat in another chair in the corner, holding a long piece of homespun that she was quilting with precise, deft movements of a seasoned seamstress. "Might as well light us a candle, Patty," she said. "It is too dark." Neobea's graying hair was concealed by a simple woolen scarf, where it would have once been decorated with a lace bonnet. There was no more lace to be had, and the last of it left from her younger days, yellowing and tattered, was stored in an old treasure trunk underneath their bed. The front door opened with a blast of ice cold, just as Patty went to rummage in the cupboard for another precious tallow candle that they used only for special occasions. A man's tall, broad-shouldered figure came inside, followed by a smaller figure. Both were carrying loads of kindling, and both were dressed in tattered, straw-stuffed coats and had their heads wrapped in homespun scarves underneath his hat and her shawl. Gusts of frozen wind and swirling flakes came after them, and the fireplace crackled loudly in protest as the wind from the chimney found a sudden new outlet. "Ah, brr!" Alan exclaimed, slapping his mittened hands together and stamping his burlap and cotton-wrapped feet to shake the snow off him. Then, turning to the figure behind him, he said, "Quickly, shut the door now, Percy." Neobea frowned. "Stop making a mess, Alan. Wipe your feet before you take another step, and you too, girl." Percy, swaddled in the only woolen shawl that the sisters shared between them, when taking turns going outside, clumsily shifted the bundle of kindling from both hands to one. She then used her shoulder to slam the old wooden door behind them and lifted the bolt and drew it in place. "Ah, that's better," Alan said as he put down his bundle on the beaten earth floor near the door and started to scrape the snow off his wrapped feet. "There's an early blizzard gathering, you know, wife. Good thing I stocked up on the hay and the flour. Put the extra blanket on the horse, too, just in case, in that drafty barn." "Good," Neobea said. We can't afford to lose the horse." Percy, meanwhile, dumped her bundle of kindling on top of the rest. She untied the woolen shawl, and underneath it was another cotton one that she kept on, since the inside of the house was chilly despite the lit fireplace. She hung up her coat and shawl and the mittens on the rack in the corner, received her father's hat and coat and hung them up, then crouched down on the floor and started to wipe her own feet and the snow-sodden bottom of her burlap skirt. "Why is it so dark?" From her narrow bed in the corner, Bethesda spoke. Her voice was louder this time, tremulous and somehow frightening. "What is it, Mother?" Alan said. "What's wrong?" "So dark," repeated the old woman and then moaned. "Oh, blessed saints! Patty, the candle, now," Neobea said anxiously. "Oh," said Patty, who'd gotten distracted by the new arrivals and now hurriedly resumed rummaging through the cupboard. Percy stood staring at her youngest sister's quick, panicked movements, and then she wiped her forehead tiredly and said, "I thought we used the last candle for All Hallows Eve." Patty stopped, turned around, her mouth falling open. Neobea frowned. "You're sure, child?" In that moment, the wind outside rose with a banshee scream, rattling the shutters, and then, all of a sudden, there was absolute silence. Not a gust. As though someone had torn all the noise from the universe. It was so silent that everyone paused involuntarily, listening. And in the silence, old Bethesda's breath came rasping. "Mother," Alan said, feeling a sudden ill premonition. Forgetting his sledge-covered feet, he took the steps to cross the small room to his old mother's bedside. "Oh, Gran," Belle said, the same premonition bringing terror to her eyes. Neobea stood up, dropping her needlework, and she crossed herself. "Granny!" Patty exclaimed. Percy remained standing near the door. She had grown absolutely still, and while the others had all their attention focused on their grandmother, Percy was looking to the shadow in the corner, the thickening of darkness at the head of the old woman's bed. Percy blinked while cold filled her, a cold beyond all colds, beyond winter itself. The cold of recognition. Because she knew that shadow. She had seen it before in the indigo twilight, lurking beneath the trunks of the thickest, oldest trees in the forest, at the edges of the lake, where the shore sloped into nothing just before it touched the water. The edges of things contained traces of it, the endings. Most recently, it had slithered in her grandmother's dark irises, and then sank away into the pupils, appearing then dissolving, as though not wanting to be caught just yet. And now here it was, fully formed in the thickness of shadows. Percy was not surprised at all. She looked at it blankly and wondered why no one else in the room had bothered to glance in the shadowed corner at the head of Bethesda's bed. Why no one else seemed to notice this thing for which she had no name. "So dark and quiet," Bethesda whispered, her breathing coming laboriously. "Oh God!" Neobea said, trembling, coming to stand before the bed, while Alan put his hand on his mother's cold and clammy forehead. "Oh," Alan, Bethesda breathed, each intake of air a great harsh shudder. Her shallow chest rose and fell. It was interminable. She's going, whispered Neobea. No time to get the priest. He wouldn't come in the storm anyway, not for us. Silent, woman, Alan said in carefully controlled anger, not wanting to raise his voice so near the old woman, and yet wanting to yell, to scream. Don't speak this way, Neobea. Don't speak a word if you must. Belle, Percy, someone get water. Yes, I'll heat some water in the kettle, Belle said, and she turned hurriedly to refill the kettle from the clay water jar. Look in the back there, on the second shelf, Neobea whispered. I've saved a small box with dry tea. Make it now. Yes, Ma. Ah, Bethesda moaned. Oh, God in heaven, have mercy. Alan held the skeletal hands of his mother, stroked her forehead. His strong, roughly hewn face was contorted, and he was biting his lips. They stood thus, long moments, filled only with the regular sound of harsh breath issuing out of the old woman, while Patty and Belle searched for the box of tea and the kettle water boiled. Neobea pulled up a bench to the bedside and made Alan sit down while she sat next to him. The fire crackled, and Percy took several steps forward, ignored by all, until she stood near the head of the bed and faced the shadow. Up close, it had no face. There was neither shape nor texture to it, only a sense of non-being, so pronounced that it stood out. Who are you? Whispered Percy, so softly that her mother barely raised her head, then looked away again. Neobea had taken a tiny holy icon of the Mother of God from its nuke altar in the corner, and now she held it gingerly in her hands, reciting a voiceless prayer with her lips only. The shadow remained silent. The kettle had boiled, and Belle poured the water over a small sprinkle of precious dry tea leaves in a large wooden bowl. She stirred it with a wooden spoon until the water turned the color of amber, then even darker, and a faint, barely pungent vapor curled from the surface. Long moments passed, while the tea cooled somewhat. Belle poured it into a mug over straining cloth, and passed it to Alan, who attempted to lift Bethesda's head up just enough so that he could tip the mug at her lips. The old woman lay passive, a doll. She did not make any attempt to part her lips or swallow, so that the warm tea dribbled down the withered skin of her cheeks, ran down her chin and throat, and soaked her thin cotton nightshirt. No, she gurgled eventually, her voice faint as a feather. Let me be, son. See, it stands here waiting for me. My time at hand. How quiet. Patty frowned, looking around then, glancing at the silent shutters on the windows and the barely crackling fireplace. It really is odd, she whispered. Why has it gotten so quiet? What, Mother? Neobea said gently. What do you see? At which point Alan began to weep. He hid his face against the old woman's chest, and his form shook silently. I see it, Percy said, responding in her grandmother's stead. There's a thing of shadow that is standing right here in the corner, near Gran's head. I'm not sure what it is, but it does not seem to be frightening or even moving. It's like a strange sentinel. Hush! Neobea exclaimed, turning to her middle daughter with anguish and outrage. How dare you say such things, horrible child, and at a time like this? Have respect for your poor grandmother. Percy looked directly in her mother's eyes. But, she said, but I can see it. Get out! Neobea screamed. She was trembling, clutching the icon of the Lord's Mother wrapped in their best cotton towel so that it nearly dropped to the floor. Percy's eyes were great and dark and liquid. While Belle and Patty stared at their sister in silence, she turned away slowly. And then Percy walked to the corner rack where their coats and shawls hung. Moving as though in a dream, she took the only woolen shawl down from the peg, wrapped it around herself, then took her ragged coat and put it on. "What are you doing, child?" But no, she had only imagined it. The words seemed to ring in her mind, soft, kind, even though no one had spoken. They were the words she wanted with all her heart to hear from someone, anyone. Words that would have given her a reason to pause. Had it been another time, maybe her father would have spoken them. He was always the kindest, and he seemed to notice things a bit more than the others. But now Alan was made insensitive by grief, his face hidden in his dying mother's chest, oblivious to all around them. And thus the words were not spoken at all. And Percy did not pause, but pulled up the bolt and then parted the door a bit, feeling the evening twilight and the icy cold rush in all at once. She stepped outside in the quiet, closed the door securely behind her, and made sure it was sealed tight, knowing that no one would bother to look back to watch her passing. She did not want them to grow chill, not from her own carelessness. Then Percy stood in the porch of their house, bathed by an impossible silence. There was no wind, only peculiar gentle snowfall. In the twilight, the snowflakes came in delicate clumps or individually, crystals from the sky. They dusted the white ground with a fresh, crisp layer, and they sparkled on the branches of the old elm tree in the backyard, and the thatched roof of the barn beyond which lay their tiny field, and across the street the neighbors' houses. They landed on her eyelashes and swept her cheeks. The world was suspended. Percy stood there like a dolt, having nowhere really to go, and indeed no will to do anything. She then slowly lowered herself on the ground and sat down in a lump right in front of her father's house, feet tucked underneath her, wrapping the burlap skirt tightly to keep out the ice, and tucking her hands in her sleeves since she had forgotten her mittens. She froze gently and watched the snow. Something strange was happening, and it had to do with the shadow in the corner and the one had stood sentinel over Gran's head. Persephone, strange girl, knew somehow that although tonight had been her grandmother's time, yet at the same time it had not, would not be. For she knew with a certainty that death was not going to claim her, or anyone else for that matter, neither this night nor the next. And that's chapter 1 of my novel, COBWEB BRIDE. It's an epic fantasy trilogy, so there are 3 books. COBWEB BRIDE is the first book, COBWEB Empire is the second book, COBWEB Forest is the third. It's a retelling of the Hades and Persephone myth, but with a really different twist. I recommend you check it out, and yes, there are some gruesome things because they're medieval Renaissance zombies, as you can see, undead, but it gets fabulous. There are gods, things, true love, all kinds of adventures, funny stuff, sad stuff. You will feel the feels of every kind, so give it a shot. I hope you enjoyed my reading, and this has been a part of TagCon 2023 Golden Disc of Ra. Go on, enjoy the rest of the convention. See you there.